The Russians managed to gain full control over the apartment complex area, following which they pushed down into the forest patch sections to the south of Kupyansk, reaching Sadova in the south, gaining control over the residential area and claiming the positions of the Ukrainians in the eastern parts of Kupyansk, leaving just a few residential areas remaining under Ukrainian control, completely cut off from supplies. At the same time, the Russians, with their solid control over the western parts of Kupyansk, pushed into the eastern parts east of the Oskil river line, establishing themselves with a foothold within the eastern parts of Kupyansk, and DRG operations are even reaching as far as Kupyansk-Kozlovy, likely from the road connecting from the south of Kupyansk into the settlement from across the Oskil river line. With the significant developments have taken place within Kupyansk, that is changing this section of the front line. The supply lines of the Russians are not really optimal, to say the least. It's a difficult position for their supplies, but the Ukrainian forces operating within Kupyansk are in an even worse position. This allows the Russians to make these advances. As for the counterattacks the Ukrainians are launching, it's towards a city, which makes it difficult for them to establish themselves, as the Russians have picked up positions on the outskirts of the city for the defense of it. The Russians also have a tunnel which goes to the east of Radkivka, which goes to the entrance of Kupyansk, allowing them to resupply their forces as long as they hold control over this intersection, and that is why that is the main target of the Ukrainians during their counterattacks. However, so far they've been unsuccessful with their capture of it. The Russian foothold gained in the eastern parts of Kupyansk allowed them to establish control over the river line itself towards the eastern direction, where the fighting is now reaching the central parts. This means the Russian forces can restart offensive operations along the railway area to connect with the forces on both banks of the Oskil river line with the eastern parts of Kupyansk, and with the offensive operations taking place on the flanks, the Ukrainian forces are dispersed through the eastern pocket. The Russian objective is, as previously stated, to reach the south in the direction of Siversk to gain full control over the western bank of the Oskil river line, encircling all of the Ukrainian positions east of the riverbank. The Russians may even cross over in the south in the direction of Siversk, which have previously attempted to establish control over the settlement and connect with the forces in the north. This means offensive operations will be mainly focused in the south, but at the same time the Russians are storming the settlements on the eastern bank of the Oskil river line. This is to keep the Ukrainian forces there as long as possible. As for crossings that already previously existed, include this bridge which was destroyed, but the areas here in the direction of Kupyansk-Kozlovy has several bridges across, and this is why it is one of the targets of the Russian forces. Gaining control over Osinovo here at the south will allow them to cut off these crossings, and that leaves only a few small areas to which the Ukrainians can continue crossing, which the Russians can focus with their FPV drones, artillery and MLRs, as well as FAB bomb strikes. To the south of Kupyansk, the Russians continued offensive operations in the direction of Lyman, where they managed to gain control over some fortifications along the second line of defense just east of Lyman. This is from the Zaporizhzhia direction, where they're pushing through the forest patch area connecting to the town. At the same time, fighting continues in the eastern outskirts of Lyman to the south, where they are fighting through the forest patch area connected to the Zaporizhzhia forest area, as well as a push through Yampil, where they're gaining control over the third quarter of the settlement, leaving just a small portion remaining under Ukrainian control in the southern outskirts. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the highway, which will allow them to gain control over several fortifications, the road connecting from Lyman to Siversk, and threaten the remaining fortifications along the Siversk River and the Obrova to gain control over the forest areas south of Lyman and to cut off the highway further west by pushing in that direction. The Russians are here putting a lot of effort into connecting the Lyman section of the front line with the Siversk section of the front line, where they've managed to advance along the railway area to the southern outskirts of Siversk, gain control over additional positions in the forest line areas here in between Vyemka and Svanivka, in addition to the capture of what remains of Kostynatynivka under Ukrainian control. With this, they have almost full control over the settlement, but a small area with a few houses to the south remains under Ukrainian control. Kostynatynivka can be considered fully under Russian control as they continue offensive operations in the direction of Svanivka, where they can connect with the forces in the north, gain control over the remaining parts of Svanivka and the farm area and forest lines in between Vyemka and Svanivka to start storming Siversk from the south, or push in the western direction to cut off the final highway connection to Siversk, completely encircling the town from all directions with a push in the south to cross over the Siversk river line, cut off the intersection here, and cutting off the intersection to the south leaves just the open fields to resupply Siversk. The alternative is to storm the town directly head on from the north, south, and east, where they'll be looking to attack it from the different directions, even from the flank. To completely attack it from so many areas, it limits the effectiveness of their defense. In either case, the Ukrainian positions within Siversk and Lyman are not much better than Kupyansk or Pokrovsk, where significant developments are taking place. Speaking of these important logistical areas, larger cities and towns that are seeing massive developments, we're also seeing similar in Kostynatynivka, where the Russians are expanding the zone of control within the eastern parts of the city as they've been geolocated further within the city itself, where the Russians are expanding the zone of control with the road from the Dacha area into the city. The Russians are expanding the zone of control within it, cutting off some of these fortifications and flanking them from the rear, similar to what they're doing in other areas of the front line. Also managed to gain control of the fortifications on the outskirts of Zaporizhzhia, expanding the zone of control along the eastern entryway, where the looking to gain full control over the 20504 highway by flanking the fortifications, as we've already geolocated Russian forces on the flank of these fortifications, where the Russians are looking to cut off the supplies and storm them from the rear, allow them to gain full control of the fortifications and have an additional highway into Kostynatynivka from the east. While at the same time, the Russians looking to flank the supply lines to the south to cut off the supplies going to Ivanopilya, and at the same time, they're advancing along the railway to gain control over the railway all the way up to the city, flank the fortifications in the south as well through this flanking maneuver. And with this, the Russians will have 3 roads into Kostynatynivka from the south and from the east through Ivanopilya and along the highway and railway, the Dacha road, as well as the eastern highway, the 20504 highway, to the Bakhmut direction. All of this significantly strengthens the logistics of the Russian forces operating in the area, with cities such as Siversk and Bakhmut connecting directly to Kostynatynivka from the east and from the south. Taking a look at the wider area of the front line, we see that the fortifications within the Donetsk region remains centered around the Slavyansk-Kostynatynivka line. If we disregard this portion and take a look at the Pokrovsk direction up towards Dobropilya, the western outskirts of the Donetsk region is largely completely unfortified. The Russian capture of Pokrovsk and Minerat opens the road to Dobropilya, following which the roads are open to the rear of Kramatorsk, the western outskirts of the Donetsk region, and the rear of Slavyansk. One of the main supply lines going through into the Slavyansk-Kostynatynivka line is the Barvinkove highway, which is connected to Kharkiv, which goes into Slavyansk from the western flank. In addition to this, there's the Izium highway in the north. These are the 2 main supply lines leading into the Slavyansk-Kostynatynivka line from the north. As with the capture of Pokrovsk and the surrounding areas, the supply lines in the west will all be cut off. If the Russians also gain control over Lyman and Siversk, then the front line will be aligned with the Slavyansk-Kostynatynivka line, leaving that as the final defensive positions of the Ukrainians within the Donetsk region. The supply lines in the north are connected through Izium and Barvinkove, which means a Russian push from Lyman in the northwestern direction and a Russian push from Pokrovsk in the northeastern direction will be able to cut off both of these supply routes, which means a Russian capture of Pokrovsk and Minerat, push onwards towards Dobropilya, and then the rear of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk will allow them to cut off one of the supply lines, one of the 2 main supply lines leading into the Slavyansk-Kostynatynivka line. This is where the most developments are needed for such a development to happen. The railway connects right there through Barvinkova towards Slavyansk. And then there is the Lyman section, gaining control over that, pushing in the direction of the Oskil river line and connecting with the positions here on the eastern bank to then threaten the highway to the south. The Russians will be able to cut off the 2nd main supply line leading into Slavyansk and Kostynatynivka. The current storming of Kostynatynivka in the south also puts a lot of the Ukrainian resources to be diverted to other sectors of the front line. Kostynatynivka part of the Smolensk-Kostynatynivka line rather than the defense of Siversk and Lyman in the north. This complicates the defense of the Ukrainian positions within the Donetsk region. So although the Russians still need a large portion of the Donetsk region to fall under their control to gain full control of it, the Ukrainian positions will be significantly weakened by the Russian capture of Pokrovsk and Milnerad, not to mention the effects of these supply lines being cut. The Siversk line is very well fortified. It will take Russians years to gain control of it, storming it head on. But by cutting off the supply lines, this can be cut off down to a few months, and a few months to capture Kostynatynivka, not to mention the large concentration of Ukrainian forces in this section of the front line to man all of these fortifications and defenses. The Ukrainian army, if they are encircled or operationally encircled within the Kostynatynivka line, will be extremely exposed in the flanks, in the Dnipropetrovsk, in the Kharkiv, or in even the Zaporizhzhia region, where they simply cannot defend all of it at the same time. And that is why the announcement of an offensive by the Russians in the eastern flank of the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia region is an extremely significant development. Because if the Russians launch a large-scale offensive in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia region, the Ukrainian forces will have two ways to respond. Either send a lot of reinforcements to the area to contain the offensive, which will limit the Russian advances in this section of the front line, but will expose the western flank of the Kostynatynivka line. The alternative is to keep their forces centered around the Pokrovsk direction, but the Russians will then manage to gain control over significant portions of the defensive lines in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia region, not to mention a push towards Pavlograd, the supply lines in the Slovyansk and Novopavlivka direction, Pokrovsk, and generally the rear of Zaporizhzhia, bypassing the fortifications to reach the city from the east and Dnipro from the south. This significantly puts a lot of pressure all across the front line for the Ukrainians and very much complicates the defense of what remains of Ukrainian positions along these fortifications, where the Russians have just completely breached the intense defensive lines that have been built along the front line by pushing through the western parts of Donetsk, through Volodar and beyond. And that is why some areas of the front line are simply so powerful, such as Volodar, which held back Russian forces for years before the Russians managed to gain control of it. And since the Russians gained control over Volodar, they have simply not stopped moving all across this front line because it bypassed the fortifications. Now, bypassing the fortifications completely and entering into an area where there simply are no fortifications completely changes everything, as the Ukrainians simply will not have the necessary forces to hold back a Russian armored push. The Russians would be able to go beyond the front line and start threatening Ukrainian FPV drone operators, forcing them to constantly be on the move, and the larger equipment, screens, and all the other stuff that they need to move around could be abandoned or too difficult to move around consistently, which significantly limits the effectiveness of their forces, and the Russians can bypass the strongest mechanism of the Ukrainian defenses, the fortifications and the FPV drones, and from there on, it is only a matter of time before the Russians capture whatever they want of Ukrainian territory. And that is why calling the current situation a disaster for the Ukrainians is at this point an understatement. The situation is rather abysmal. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching, and really on this note, have a great day and see you all next time.